All right, let's jump right into it. Today, we're taking on a genuinely fascinating topic. We are going to demystify the human-made structures that actually drive our global economy. Have you ever wondered who exactly pulls the massive levers of global trade? Or why a seemingly random financial hiccup in one country can literally impact your wallet halfway across the world? Well, let's unpack the whole shebang. Straight from a fantastic foundational text, George Ritzer's Globalization: The Essentials. We're going to use this as our objective historical lens to make sense of a truly massive topic. Ritzer gives us the perfect framework to understand not just what our economy looks like right now, but the pretty incredible history of how it was actually built from the ground up. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our chronological roadmap for today. We'll start with the first global age, then cover the birth of Bretton Woods, how the system fractures, critiquing the institutions, modern power players, and finally we'll ask, is this all reality or a myth? Starting right off with Part 1, the first global age. Think of this as the prequel to modern globalization. Let's see how this builds, because first, we need to shatter a really common misconception. A highly interconnected global economy, it is not a purely modern invention brought about by the internet. No way. To understand our current economic structures, we actually have to look back over a century to a time when steamships and telegraphs were the absolute cutting edge of connectivity. We had a prior epoch of globalization that kicked off around 1896 and peaked just before World War I. Then, things took a remarkably dark turn in the 1930s, followed by a massive reconstruction effort in 1944, which eventually led to a huge shock to the system in 1971. The events of this era literally form the skeleton key to understanding the macroeconomics of the last century. So, what really shattered that first global age? Well, 2 world wars and the Great Depression. In the 1930s, terrified nations turned inward to something called autarky. Basically, this means a nation tries to become entirely self-sufficient, completely cutting off global trade. It's like building an economic fortress. This devastating economic isolationism was the exact problem that the post-World War II world desperately needed to solve, just to avoid another global depression. Which brings us to Part 2, the birth of Bretton Woods, or the Master Plan. And this brilliantly illustrates how that master plan came together. That massive fear of another depression brought about a truly historic meeting. In July 1944, with World War II actually still raging, delegates met at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal? To engineer a new open international economy, essentially from scratch. They built 3 main pillars. First, the GATT, which later evolved into the World Trade Organization, designed to lower tariffs and boost global trade. Second, the IMF, to establish a stable monetary order and keep exchange rates reliable. And third, the World Bank, to fund massive global investment and infrastructure. These 3 institutions were purpose-built to basically force international economic cooperation. Now, I know it is super easy to get the IMF and the World Bank confused, so let's quickly clarify their original distinct missions. The IMF was created to be the guardian of macroeconomic stability. Imagine a country running out of money to pay its international bills. The IMF would step in to stabilize their exchange rates. The World Bank, on the other hand, was meant for structural development. Think of them funding physical, tangible infrastructure, like massive roads and dams, to help nations physically grow and rebuild. But, as we know, nothing lasts forever. Moving to Part 3, the system fractures. So, this Bretton Woods system absolutely fueled massive global growth for decades, but it had a fatal flaw. It was entirely dependent on the US dollar, which was, at the time, pegged to gold. By 1971, that reliance caused the whole thing to falter. The balance of global power had shifted, other economies got stronger, speculators started attacking the dollar, and the US economy began to struggle. Ultimately, President Nixon took the US off the gold standard, effectively ending the original Bretton Woods system overnight. The fracture was so profound that IMF staff actually circulated this surprisingly humorous, gloomy internal notice. It read, "R.I.P. We regretfully announce the not unexpected passing away of Bretton Woods, born in 1944, dead at 27. With fixed exchange rates gone, the world entered a totally new, highly unpredictable era of floating currencies." And without those strict anchoring rules of Bretton Woods, countries started to slide backward. Nations began finding clever little ways to bypass free trade agreements through protectionism. This means they started systematically using tariffs and quotas to block foreign competitors. While they weren't going back to full-blown autarky, nations were definitely prioritizing their own domestic industries again, really testing the limits of this supposed global cooperation.
This perfectly sets up Part 4, critiquing the institutions from an insider's perspective. Because those institutions of Bretton Woods, they didn't just vanish, they evolved. And in many ways, they became much more controversial. To understand these modern complications, we can look to the impartial insights of renowned economist Joseph Stiglitz. And this is a true insider's view because Stiglitz was actually the chief economist at the World Bank itself. A major target of his critique is a concept called structural adjustment. It's helpful to think of the IMF here like a very strict medical doctor. When developing nations got sick and needed a financial loan, the IMF wouldn't just hand over the cash, no questions asked. They prescribed harsh medicine, structural adjustment. They demanded tight budgets, the privatization of state-run systems, and heavy deregulation. Basically, if you wanted the bailout, you had to radically restructure your entire economy to fit their specific model. Now, what's really interesting about this contrast is how far things drifted. The original mission of these institutions was undeniably noble, helping countries weather economic downturns to prevent global crashes. But Stiglitz argues that the modern reality morphed into something else entirely, imposing rigid austerity, essentially turning the institutions into enforcers of Western financial interests. He views them as applying this one-size-fits-all approach that completely ignores the unique cultural and economic needs of developing nations. And ironically, he argues this often ends up stifling the very economic growth they're supposed to be creating. At this point, you might be wondering, okay, but how does this macro-level stuff actually affect me? Well, just look at the Great Recession of 2008 as a major reality check. American banks bundled up local, highly risky subprime mortgages and sold them globally. When those very localized American loans failed, financial institutions across the entire planet nearly collapsed like dominoes. It proved, undeniably, that our modern economies are dangerously, inextricably intertwined. We are all quite literally living in the exact same financial web.
Let's look at who else is pulling the strings today. Part 5, Modern Power Players. Because today, the global economy isn't just run by the Bretton Woods Big Three. There has been a massive shift in power dynamics since the late 20th century. Power is increasingly concentrating into these massive regional blocs. Just look at the European Union and the Eurozone, uniting huge swaths of Europe into a single massive market. Look at NAFTA in North America, linking the US, Canada, Mexico. Or consider OPEC, which leverages the massive natural resource of oil to literally dictate global energy prices. These regional organizations wield incredible market power, sometimes rivaling or even superseding traditional international institutions. And we absolutely can't ignore what are perhaps the most powerful modern players of all, multinational corporations, or MNCs. These entities have evolved from companies tied to a specific home nation into vast, borderless titans. They don't just export goods anymore. They build factories, logistics networks, and infrastructure right inside foreign countries, often bypassing traditional trade barriers entirely. They are the primary engines of global investment today, seamlessly moving trillions of dollars globally and fundamentally shaping the economies wherever they decide to land. Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, Reality or a Myth. So, the crucial point is this. We have covered a massive amount of historical and structural ground today. And after everything we've discussed, we have to test the evidence and ask, is this hyper-connected economy a unique modern reality? Well, academics Paul Hurst and Graham Thompson present a highly provocative critique. They actually argue that economic globalization is a myth. They point right back to that first global age we talked about at the very beginning of this explainer. They argue that, based on the sheer flow of capital and the relatively open borders of that era, the world economy was arguably more open between 1870 and 1914 than it is right now today. Which leaves us with this final, massive question for you to ponder. We've seen the rise and sudden fall of Bretton Woods. We've seen the emergence of borderless corporate titans and the creation of absolutely massive regional blocs. But is our current global economy a truly unprecedented reality? Is it something humanity has literally never seen before? Or are we simply living through an exaggerated myth, repeating a century-old cycle of boom, bust, and interconnectivity? It's like a giant historical puzzle. Think about that the next time you hear news about global trade, tariffs, or inflation. Thank you so much for joining me today to untangle these massive structures. And as always, keep your curiosity sharp.